Hi guys. Now today we're going to focus on two characters. So we can see them as contrasting characters, although they do share some characteristics, a limited number of characteristics or traits. So we're going to focus on Mrs. Johnson versus Mrs. Lyons. And then we're going to focus on a key moment, okay, a pivotal moment in the play. And you can use this as a dramatic moment or simply just a key moment, or something that is impactful perhaps as well in terms of plot and theme. And that's obviously, of course, when Mrs. Lyons convinces Mrs. Johnson then to allow her to adopt Edward. Okay, so our first protocol is to focus on the two contrasting characters or foils as such. So once more, make sure, of course, that you have paper in front of you and then that you're jotting down the main points as we're going through. So we're focusing on key vocabulary here. And you may then, as we're reading through the key moment, maybe just jot down a couple of quotations as well. Remember, when it comes to a comparative play, you don't necessarily need a wealth of quotations, just one or two well-chosen individual words or a key phrase or a short quotation will suffice. Most of the time you will just make references to key moments, key characters, and so on. Okay, so we'll start with what some people may term or may call the antagonist or the villain of the piece then, Mrs. Lyons. So remember, we were emphasizing context and we were emphasizing circumstance and class, and then we were focusing on character as well. So Mrs. Lyons, remember, of course, important for her role as well as for her character. Okay, so we may see her then as kind of villainous because she is very manipulative and very calculating. So all we have to do then, of course, is to simply think of examples from the play and then think of her behavior and think of her language and think of some quotations that we could use then to reinforce those. So our first protocol then, our first point essentially in terms of Mrs. Lyons would be that she is sympathetic at first. Okay, remember that Mrs. Johnson then, of course, confides in her. So at the very beginning, of course, we're sympathetic. Why? Because she appears to be quite lonely and quite isolated. She lives in what Mrs. Johnson refers to, using that metaphor, as a palace, but she appears to have sort of few friends and confidants. She appears to have very few, we'd say, family members. Her husband is away on business quite a lot of the time. So she seems to kind of fend for herself and she is desperate for a child. So you would emphasize the point, of course, that she is sympathetic at first because she appears quite lonely and isolated, and she is infertile, or as a couple, Mr. and Mrs. Lyons are infertile. So that would be your first point here, such that even though she enjoys the trappings of wealth, she has everything essentially that money can buy, she doesn't have the one thing that she wants. The one thing that torments her, of course, is her childlessness. Okay, the second point then, and we're kind of moving towards then, of course, her interaction with Mrs. Johnson and then her behaviour throughout the remainder of Act 1 and then into Act 2. So she's quite manipulative or exploitative. Okay, so those would be the two key words that we'd use there. If we think about it, of course, she obviously blackmails Mrs. Johnson. She kind of stonewalls her. She more or less forces her to accept this particular pact or agreement then that she outlines. So it's fueled by desperation, and it's fueled by, of course, her longing or yearning for a child. But you could even say that her behaviour becomes more and more erratic and unhinged throughout the play, and therefore she becomes less sympathetic. And that's very important, of course, that we look at the examples then as to why we lose sympathy for this particular character who garnered sympathy at the beginning of Act 1. So we see her as very controlling then, essentially. And we could even go as far then for point number 3 to say that she's quite cunning and devious. She's very calculating, ruthless, or callous as such. I mean, even think about the simple examples here when she manipulates Mrs. Johnson, but also her husband. And then she attempts to control Edward and his every movement then. She's kind of fiercely jealous then of the contact that he has made with Mickey and with his biological mother. Okay, so that's actually very, very important then as well. Even at the beginning, or towards the beginning, then of course, she sort of reneges on the deal that she had struck with Mrs. Johnstone, this kind of unspoken agreement essentially then, that Mrs. Johnstone would continue to see Edward. Remember that she lies to her husband when Mrs. Johnstone is kind of fussing over the baby. She essentially makes the claim then that Mrs. Johnstone is not doing her job properly, not fulfilling her duties, therefore she must be sacked, and then she gives her the £50 note as well. So the emotional bribery, the threats, of course, the literal bribes then really emphasize what a cold and calculating woman she can be. But then we have to kind of temper that by thinking about why she behaves like that. And do we still see her as slightly sympathetic throughout Act 1? And then maybe she changes our minds then in Act 2 when she becomes quite aggressive and even violent, essentially then too. Okay, so she terrifies Mrs. Johnstone by saying, you won't tell anyone. If you do, you will kill them. And remember, of course, that she's playing and preying upon Mrs. Johnstone's superstitious nature here as well, where Mrs. Johnstone believes, of course, that something terrible will befall her children, will befall the twins if she reveals the truth. Okay, so she focuses, Mrs. Lyons focuses very much on that. Okay, so you could say then that she's villainous, as I've mentioned then as well, kind of putting all of those together and just using that particular point then, because towards the end she becomes very, very vindictive. Remember that she literally points out Edward to Mickey. Literally it says, of course, that she turns Mickey around to face Edward. And this is the point then, of course, of where the tragedy unfolds. Okay, there is no dialogue there. It's deliberately silent and reminds us at the very beginning of the play then, of course, when we had the tragic deaths of Mickey and Edward. Okay, so the idea is, of course, that she's very spiteful, very vengeful as such then, very vindictive, and then that feeds in then to the villainy and her kind of masterstroke at the end of the play. Okay, you can say very simply then that she's very determined, quite headstrong. Nothing and no one will stand in her way. You could admire that to a certain degree. She's very focused and very single-minded, and think of various examples throughout the play there. You could also make the point that she's quite idealistic. I mean, she prides herself on being sort of practical, but in a way she's very idealistic when it comes to motherhood, and we'll focus on that in our key scene, our key moment in a few seconds as well, where she kind of focuses on the idea of parenthood as kind of fulfilling, or motherhood as fulfilling all of her dreams. And she's very, very strict with Edward, and she's kind of proprietorial as well, almost as if he is just simply a puppet to be manipulated, or just simply that she owns him and therefore she can control everything about him. We see exactly what transpires then at the very end of the play. Okay, we could perhaps just see her as clever, resourceful. Okay, she's quite persuasive then, the language that she uses. She's opportunistic in the way that she seizes upon Mrs. Johnstone's pregnancy and then focuses on how she can use that to her advantage. So kind of positive and negative in terms of the traits there as well. So it's a good idea to have, we say, a good balance in terms of characteristics and traits. You might have 2 positive or 2 negative, or maybe we'd say for this particular character, maybe 3 negative and 1 positive. Okay, and then try to have quite specific examples. Right, if we're looking then at Mrs. Johnstone then, she's sympathetic throughout. I mean, she does have her flaws or foibles, but essentially she is a sympathetic character throughout, and that's established at the very beginning. Remember the last day we were emphasising that society judges her very harshly. She's a victim of circumstance. She's been abandoned by her husband. She has many mouths to feed. She's hardworking, diligent, and so on. So we're kind of emphasising those particular points the last day, and then we need to elaborate on those. Okay, so we said, of course, that she's very superstitious, and that feeds into the theme of fate or destiny. That's a very particular theme, of course, that we're going to be looking at as well, because that's a very important theme when it comes to Romeo and Juliet. So even her silly superstitions when it comes to the shoes on the table, remember that even Mrs. Lyons is almost believing that, of course, later on in the play, where she doesn't want Edward to leave his shoes on the table. And then we see, of course, the tragedy unfolding at the very end of the play as a result of fate then intervening. So we see her as very vulnerable, sort of ripe for exploitation then, how Mrs. Lyons is able to manipulate and persuade her. We see her as downtrodden, okay? She's impoverished and desperate, but she's also, of course, a very moral person. We'll be focusing in a moment, of course, on her objections then to Mrs. Lyons adopting Edward. Her initial reaction, her instinctive reaction, is to refuse the agreement put forward by Mrs. Lyons. So she has a finely tuned moral sense or moral fulcrum as such, but we can see then how she can be persuaded because Mrs. Johnson then, of course, Mrs. Lyons uses emotional blackmail then to convince her. Okay, we can say in terms of her role, of course, she's very important as an instrument of fate. She also becomes, of course, a victim of fate herself. So think of her husband, then the pregnancy, a victim of society's attitudes, a victim then of Mrs. Lyons and her determination to become a mother, a victim of class and background. Okay, so you could emphasize all of that, just relating back to how fate conspires against her, of course, and her two sons, and undermines all of her efforts then, of course, to be happy or to make them happy. Okay, we can see that perhaps unlike Mrs. Lyons, she's very emotional, she's very attentive and affectionate and warm. Sometimes she can be quite practical, sometimes, of course, she can be rather feather-headed as well, or feather-brained, in that we say how she wants to grant the children's wishes all of the time, and she's a bit of a spendthrift, perhaps. She's not very good or very economical with money, so you can emphasize that particular point then. And remember that she becomes very emotional when she's focusing on Edward as well. Some people would say sentimental, but it really emphasizes a mother's love, how she cannot bear to part with him. And then that dominates the rest of her life, even though she tries to overcome her emotional attachment then to him. I mean, even the fact that she gives him the locket, of course, and that's supposed to symbolize her deep and abiding love then for her son. And we see then, of course, how loyal she is to both of her children. And then at the very end, of course, once more, the instrument of fate, then she literally tells Mickey the truth. We could also say that she's more progressive as a parent or a mother, more modern, we'd say, and less old-fashioned in her outlook, as opposed to Mrs. Lyons, who tends to be quite conservative and quite traditional. And the obvious example of that then, of course, would be when the boys want to go to see the pornographic film. She doesn't disapprove or she doesn't shame them in any way. And that's very different then, of course, to Mrs. Lyons, who's quite prim and proper in her middle-class world. Okay, so those would be the sort of 4 or 5 basic points that you could have then in terms of Mrs. Johnson and Mrs. Lyons, okay, and how different they are. But as I said, of course, they do share some similarities. Okay, so relating it back then to Act 1, and remember we finished the last day by focusing on where the gynecologist reveals to Mrs. Johnson then that she's having twins, and she is shocked by this. So it's just simply described then how she returns to work numbed by the news, and Mrs. Lyons can't even get through to her at first, of course. So this is emphasizing then the key moment where the pact is made, where the deal is struck, and it reinforces what we've just been looking at in terms of the contrasting characters, but also plot, and also, of course, in terms of our key theme, which is fate. And remember what I said before, that relates back to Romeo and Juliet. They are constantly being frustrated and undermined and thwarted by fate and destiny. Okay, so Mr. Lyons is very sympathetic, first of all, saying, why don't you sit down? And then Mrs. Johnson just blurts out everything. So she's in shock, of course, and that's why she confides in her. Because otherwise, think about it, they don't have much of a friendship. It's an employer-employee situation here at the very beginning of the play as such. So everything then just comes pouring out, she says. I can't deal with two. The welfare has already been on to me. They say I'm incapable of controlling the kids, that I should put some of them into care and so on. So she reveals then to Mrs. Lyons that she's expecting twins. And then the narrator, of course, is obviously punning on that then. How quickly an idea planted can take root and grow into a plan. The thought conceived in this very room grew as surely as a seed in a mother's womb. So the word conceive, of course, obviously then to conceive, to come up with an idea, but also to become pregnant. Now, immediately, and Mrs. Lyons says it quietly at first, it says almost inaudibly in the stage directions, give one to me. What? Give one of them to me. So think about it. This sort of emphasises her opportunistic nature. Okay, she's presented with the news that Mrs. Johnson is having twins and it's going to be very difficult for her. So immediately she thinks about how this is going to be of benefit to her. Okay, so that would suggest opportunistic. It might suggest, of course, a very calculating, selfish nature then as well, as we've emphasised already. Okay, so Mrs. Johnson, of course, assumes that it's a joke, but think about her first reaction. But you can't just... So this sort of emphasises what we said before about the idea of her moral response here, kind of ethical response as such to the suggestion. And then Mrs. Lyons simply asks, when are you due? Think about how she's improvising here. She's being very spontaneous, essentially, thinking very quickly. So she tells, quickly, tell me, when are you due? July. And my husband doesn't get back until the middle of July. He'd never guess. And then Mrs. Johnson just assumes this is a joke. Oh, it's mad. She says, I know it's mad, but it's wonderful. It's perfect. Look, you're what, 4 months pregnant? But you're only just beginning to show. So I'm 4 months pregnant and I'm only just beginning to show. So she grabs a cushion then and demonstrates the idea that they could get away with it. I could have got pregnant just before he went away, but I didn't tell him in case I miscarried. So notice how all of the embellished parts of the story come to her straight away. It really emphasises how resourceful and how cunning she is. I didn't want to worry him whilst he was away. When he arrives home, I'll tell him we were wrong and the doctors were wrong. I have a baby, our baby. It will work if only you... Oh, Mrs. Lyons, you can't be serious. You said yourself, you said you had too many children already. So think about what she's doing here, how she's manipulating Mrs. Johnson. She uses quite a lot of reason and logic. She's making the story very plausible. So Mrs. Johnson, of course, cannot disagree as such. Then we see how she begins to sort of threaten her later on. She uses emotional blackmail. She becomes very aggressive and violent later on in the play as well. So 4 or 5 different ways or methods of convincing Mrs. Johnson here. So Mrs. Johnson then, of course, obviously makes the point, yeah, but I don't know if I want to give one away. And then Mrs. Lyons, already you're being threatened by the welfare people. So just kind of cleverly reminding her of her circumstances. With 2 more children, how can you possibly avoid some of them being put into care? Okay, so emphasising, like I said, logic and reason here. Surely it's better to give 1 child to me, so being very convincing and persuasive. Look, at least if the child's with me, you'd be able to see him every day as you came to work. So that sounds much more agreeable, but then think about how she reneges on that later on in the play. Okay, where she doesn't allow Mrs. Johnson to continue to see Edward, and in fact she fires her, okay, making her circumstances even worse essentially for all the other children, including the mother as well. Okay, so she's willing her then to agree, as it says in the stage directions here, and then Mrs. Johnson realises, are you that desperate to have a baby? Okay, then we have the idealistic scenarios coming to play here, where Mrs. Lyons then sings and kind of emphasise the idea that she has this very sort of romantic notion then of motherhood and what it entails. So she emphasises first of all, of course, then her longing and yearning essentially. Each day I look out of the window, and we're supposed to find that sympathetic, of course, and convincing essentially. I've dreamt of all the places I would take him, the games we'd play, the stories I'd tell, the jokes we'd share. It's almost like she's looking for a friend rather than a son, rather than a child as such here. So the melody then shifts into that of Mrs. Johnson, who is looking at Mrs. Lyons. So think about it, she's a very emotional person, a very instinctive person. So obviously she is having her sort of heartstrings pulled at, then manipulated by Mrs. Lyons. Mrs. Lyons then gives her a half smile and a shrug, perhaps slightly embarrassed at what she has revealed, as a kind of repressed English or middle class English woman, essentially, then sort of catching hold of herself, sort of realizing that she's given too much away. But think about it, this is actually very persuasive because Mrs. Johnson is quite emotional as such there too. So Mrs. Johnson then turns and looks at the room. Remember, this is very important. Remember, we were looking before as to why her home is never actually revealed in terms of the interior and why Mrs. Lyons is. This is actually a pivotal moment then where she looks around and she sees where her child could grow up and the advantages and the opportunities that he would have with Mrs. Lyons. So it's referenced then the comparative opulence, so the wealth and the ease of the place. And Mrs. Johnson then refers to Mrs. Lyons' home using, obviously here a metaphor, if my child was raised in a palace like this, so using hyperbole, but remember, of course, then the opposite would be something like a hovel or a shack then, if she were to refer to her own house. So she worries then, of course, obviously about her child and emphasizing then, I wouldn't have to worry where his next meal was coming from. His clothing would be supplied by George Henry Lee, and that was a very famous department store in Liverpool at the time. I think they're making it into a casino now at this particular stage. So Mrs. Lyons then pounces on this. She sees that Mrs. Johnson might be persuaded, and we see her singing again, and this is all supposed to be very plausible and very convincing and very persuasive. He'd have all his own toys and a garden to play in. Now we have the antiphonal song here. Remember the over and back, essentially, the conversational song, where Mrs. Lyons will sing a line or two and then Mrs. Johnson will chime in with a line or two and it's over and back. And this is supposed to be the idea of a very harmonious agreement at this particular juncture or point in the play as such. Okay, so they have this sort of idealistic notion then of what life would be like if they separate the twins and Mrs. Lyons has her way. Okay, so all of that is very, very important. And we see then, of course, how desperate once more Mrs. Lyons is to have a child, as she says twice, my child, my child. So then they embrace. Mrs. Johnson is slightly embarrassed, but what does she do then? She takes out a Bible. And remember, that's very, very important here because the Bible is quite symbolic and it's also a reminder then, of course, of a court of law. So when you're a witness, essentially, in a court of law, you stand in the witness box, you put your hand, of course, on the Bible and you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God. So think about it then. Mrs. Johnson is convinced that this is binding, that she can't go back on her word. It kind of relates back to a kind of superstition in a way then. And even then at this early stage, Mrs. Lyons is thinking about planning ahead, thinking about how she's going to use the cushion, of course, when she goes outside to do the shopping so that everyone will know that she is pregnant. Okay, so we have the thing then when the narrator just comments on it, in the name of Jesus, the thing was done. Now there's no going back for anyone. It's too late now for feeling torn. There's a pact been sealed. There's a deal been born. And think of the language that is used there, pact and deal. It's like a business transaction, or it's like, of course, a contract that has been signed. And this is a reality for Mrs. Johnson, of course, that she really cannot renege on this particular deal. And if you think of the word pact, we've said this before, that a pact, of course, reminds us like something of a negotiation, perhaps something military or something political, following the aftermath of a battle or a war as such then too. And that could relate back then, of course, to the falling out between Mrs. Johnson and Mrs. Lyons, and then the terrible tragedy, of course, the bloodshed at the very end. Okay, so what you need to do then is you need to focus on our two contrasting characters, and you can relate it back then to the key moment or the key point in Act 1, Scene 1. In the next class then, we're going to focus on Mickey versus Edward. And then next week, we're going to focus on the ending, and I'll also give you some points then on revision. So I'll post that later on in the week on the Google Groups as well, in terms of what you need to revise and what you need to focus on for the exam. Until then, make sure you have your points, look for examples, find a few quotations, and don't forget, instead of just reading it over and over again, watch it. It's much easier to absorb it, and it's much more interesting and entertaining as well. Okay, until tomorrow, guys. See you then.